Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. I'm your host, Eamon McAdam, and I've actually got a few things to talk about today. I think it's pretty obvious given what's been happening, and especially the really tragic news from Lebanon yesterday that the Israelis had struck Beirut in a targeted assassination of a Hamas leader in the southern suburbs of Beirut, which is particularly upsetting because it's the very first time they've done this openly since at least 2006. It marks a kind of new escalation in the Israeli aggression, not just on Palestinians, but also on Lebanon. But before we get into all that, this is being recorded on the 3rd of January. So it's been an interesting new year. I think I felt something that a lot of people did, which is I didn't know how to respond to Happy New Year wishes, because I don't know. I don't even know what any of it means anymore. But I don't want to lie to people, People ask me, how are you? And I could very easily just say like, oh yeah, all right, But I don't know. I want to live authentically. But also, I don't think any of us are doing okay. So I don't know why. I prefer that we don't all just lie to each other, But still, I find myself, when people ask, I say I'm not doing well, and they say, why? Which I find surprising, and especially people from my family who are very aware. And then when I tell them why, they're like, oh, of course, and they know. But I've gotten a lot of different responses to that, and a lot of them are kind of pieces of advice. It's like, I'm aware. And obviously I know that me getting depressed about these things don't have like a material benefit for anybody really. But at the same time, I don't think any of us have it figured out. So I find it a bit, I don't know how to deal with piece of advice where it's like, like I don't want to undermine their feelings of confidence about what they're telling me. And it's just a lot of different versions of, there's nothing we can do, so might as well just, bear witness, but not let it affect you that much. And one of my core problems with that is it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you only tell yourself that I can't do anything, you're just basically undermining yourself before you even start. And you're giving yourself no ability or time to think about, well, wait, what can I do? Which, again, I don't have any answers, and obviously the way I've been dealing with these things hasn't been great for me. But I think there is still something to the idea of, this is unprecedented. This is a genocide that we are witnessing, that we all feel incredibly incapable of doing anything about, anything meaningful. I don't know, people have been making a lot of comparisons with the Holocaust, with just so many other things. And the question is, if you've ever thought about what you would be doing, you would have done at the time, you're doing it now, This definitely feels like something that, if something is to move us, it would be this, Honestly, I think there's one thing that's constantly been on repeat in my life, which is very vividly and very intimately feeling it. I think a lot of people on the left and a lot of people who are progressive or who are leftist or who whatever have this knee-jerk assumption that when it happens, things will change. Things will only get so bad before they start getting better. And coming from Beirut, which has seen a lot of issues, I've seen it, The biggest example of it is the fucking port explosion. And you'd imagine that that's it, and we all felt it. There was a kind of feeling of impetus just afterwards. And I've discussed this with a lot of people, that the first week or two after the explosion were nowhere near as depressing as the second month, when things just kind of had to go back to normal, where accountability was really just feeling like an impossibility. And it's been 3 years now, right? And nothing's fucking changed. It's just all gotten worse. The people who are responsible for it are still in charge. The only thing that's changed is that the people who have been protesting it have been intimidated. I think one of the lawyers who was dealing with some of these claims against the state has been facing assassination attempts. I think there was a guy who was in the military. I don't know. Regardless, I think now we've experienced collectively a bunch of versions of that thing vis-a-vis Palestine. So I think October 17 was the first when the Israelis bombed, I think it was Al-Shifa Hospital or Al-Ahli. And there was just this massive feeling across the globe, protests, even at it was midnight at the time when the news was really coming out. There was really that feeling of, no, they've stepped too far. They've done this horrendous massacre and destroyed this hospital. Things are going to change now. And of course, that was 2 months ago. And so many other versions of those things. They use white phosphorus. They're killing journalists at an unprecedented scale. There are just too many things to name. And I keep feeling, this is it. This has to change. And I think the fact that nothing is changing, that it's just perpetuating and only getting worse, is kind of just confirming to me something that's one of the most depressing and cynical things that I've been resisting accepting as truth, which is that, I don't know, there's we are living in a brutal, brutal world. I mean, who do we complain to, Who's the authority? There's just this constant conclusion that all we have is each other. And when we are so fragmented and disempowered, that feels really depressing. There used to be this feeling wherein, there's sort of this idea of the UN, or even in certain cases like the quote-unquote international community. But I think a lot of that feeling is probably much more dismissed, that feeling of the responsibility of the quote-unquote international community. I think most presently was the crushing of the Syrian revolution. And a lot of the similar things we're seeing now, just taking place on a longer scale and being done by Assad and his sponsors and Russia. But now we're seeing it by an ally of the US and funded by the US. And it's just, who do we appeal to? There's no one that's going to come save any of us. And so it's quite depressing, and it is difficult not to fall into despair. But at the same time, despair is kind of a form of privilege, which is very difficult to kind of unpack because it doesn't feel very privileged. But compared to those who don't have a choice to fall to despair, who just have to continue because the option isn't despair or hope, it's resisting or death. So what's happening and the expansion of this violence into Lebanon is honestly something that's really scary for me, and has been something obviously that's in the back of a lot of our minds, but I don't know. I also woke up today to news that there was a bomb in Iran at a funeral procession commemorating the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, killing about 100 people, I think. And just now, before I started recording, there was an assassination of, I think, 1 or 3 Hezbollah officials in the south of Lebanon. It's just very clear that the Israelis want to push this further, and what's really scary is no one's going to stop them. Because none of those its that I just talked about were met with anything except ignorance, like a willful ignorance, I mean, fucking Joe Biden is still talking about 40 beheaded babies, so we really live in a world with no leadership, even though I'm very skeptical of the entire concept of leadership in that sense. But scary times. I am nervous, and I'll definitely be talking a lot more about that on this podcast. But before I get too heavy, I want to bring something up that is a bit of a follow-through from the last episode. So, keen listeners to this podcast would remember that I had an incident with my 85-year-old neighbor, Helga. So, updates. There's more that's happened. Although, it is all very tragic. This isn't like hot goss. It's kind of just sad state of affairs, but also a bit difficult. So, New Year's Day, me and my partner are woken by incessant ringing at the doorbell at 9 a.m. And my partner goes to open the door, and this is 9 a.m. We're just completely woken up and it's ringing. So it's our neighbor. at 9 a.m. And she's yelling in this really nasally Austrian way, where it's just a lot of this and the I could hear what she was saying, and she was saying a lot about the washing machine and was kind of accusing us of breaking her washing machine, which I was super confused by, but also I could tell that she's just rambling. So this goes on for about 10 minutes. My partner closes the door, sort of agrees with them, with the neighbor, that listen, calm down. Let's go talk about this. And I discover that she got to the point she was sort of threatening to call the police because she was super convinced that we broke into her house and broke her washing machine. And so I wait there for about an hour. I'm still in bed. And when my partner comes back, I discover that our neighbor really is kind of losing grasp of reality. And it's quite scary. She, in the end, would manage to like calm down and sort of apologize. But yeah, that was a pretty upsetting episode. And we thought that was kind of the end of it. But today, we get another rude awakening in the form of the ringing of our intercom. Also at 8 a.m. It's the same neighbor. This time, she locked herself out of not just her apartment, the building. And not just locked herself out, the cat ran out as well. So my partner wakes up, runs down. The reason my partner is the main one to deal with this, for several reasons, but mostly is I don't speak any German. My German is just not at all up to standard to be able to deal with such a, you know what I mean, like an expert level situation. You know, I know how to order food. I don't know how to placate and to calm down a, you know, erratic 85-year-old woman who's clearly going through like mental health issues and like just health issues in general. I think that's more like B2 or C1. Sorry, that was a bad joke. Anyway, so my partner kind of brings her back inside. They call a locksmith. It turns out that she's locked herself out because she's just changed her keys because she's still convinced that people did. She feels insecure in her home. And this is kind of related to that accusation, you know, and that thing about the feeling that, I don't know, someone's out to get her and like breaking her washing machine. So it's just, they talk to another neighbor, also 80 years old. I am surrounded by 80-year-old women. This is my experience of Vienna. And so they wait up there until the locksmith shows up and opens the door. Locksmiths are crazy. This is like I know they do other stuff and they probably get these calls rarely, but they come in, all it is, they just like pop the lock and it opens up immediately. It's like 10 seconds of work, poof, 150 euros. It's happened to me. And it's shocking. It's what? 100, it took a minute. And I get it. There's another joke my mother, it's not even a joke, like she tells it as a story, which is, it's this one where someone sees Picasso in a restaurant and goes up to him and is like, "Oh my God, you're Picasso." And the guy in Picasso's like, "Yeah." So he's like, "Could you draw me something?" And he gives him a napkin. So Picasso kind of like scribbles something, you know, his style. He gives it to the guy, hands it to him. And he tells him, "That'll be $1 million. And the guy says, "What? It just took you 5 seconds." Picasso says, "Well, yes, it took me 5 seconds, but it took me, 5 years or like 50 years to be able to do it in 5 seconds. As a freelancer, I appreciate that. The implications of that story. But yeah, it's one of those silly ones. So anyway, now the other neighbor is apparently they go to the same GP. So she's going to talk to the GP. My neighbor Helga should not be living alone. And it is getting to the point where it's kind of like endangering, herself, her cat. Yeah, I don't know. She needs help. And we definitely can't provide that. I don't know how else to say it. Anyway, hopefully I'll have a new update next time. But I did want to share that story because it's taking up a lot of our thinking. Strangely, much more than we'd have anticipated. If you'd asked me a week ago, what do you plan on doing in the new year? I wouldn't have been saying, taking care of our 85-year-old neighbor, which I should mention because I realized that I didn't in the last episode. So it made me seem much worse than if I had mentioned. But my first interaction with this person, with Helga, was sitting in the garden. It's a long story, but essentially she yelled at me. She screamed at me. And I had no idea what was going on. And apparently she has some beef with the other neighbor. And so she was like, but she screamed. I haven't had someone scream at me in a very long time, probably since I was a child. And she just, das ist meine Garten. That's my garden is basically what she's saying, even though it's like a communal garden. And I wasn't doing anything, I was just sitting. But anyway, all that to say, we got off on the wrong foot, but also she just seems like she's a difficult person in general. So yeah, that's another Helga update. I hope that doesn't start becoming a kind of series, but it is what it is. I mean, if it isn't obvious, I am actually it sounds so weird, but I'm a bit glad that something like this is happening because there's not much going on in my life, and it kind of sort of something else to talk about because otherwise everything is just incredibly doom and gloom and violence and impotence. I think there's, on top of the fact that these things are happening and there's some of the most atrocious and gut-wrenching things that we're witnessing and in many cases experiencing, it's nice to have a kind of other narratives, let's say. See, the reason that this attack on Beirut is so terrifying, not just that it signals, obviously, a desire by the Israelis to, expand their war effort. I think it is as simple as that they want to cross all these red lines that all these other groups, that Hezbollah, that Iran have set, and intentionally crossing it and just, pushing for an escalation, pushing for a retaliation that they know they have support to double down on. And that's really fucking scary. And for me personally, obviously Beirut is my home, my whole family is there, all my friends are there, it's my city. Is a big part of why I even left Beirut to begin with 2 years ago, is because something like this was inevitable. That I felt it in my bones, that I'd been worried of a new Israeli war for a couple of years before I eventually left, culminating in, like intense anxiety attacks, especially, when I would literally hear and feel the Israeli jets. There's one incident that is not really spoken about, and it's sort of one of those things that if we lived in a sane world, this would merit just as much of a response as anything else. But on December 2020, it's actually a weird story. I'm sitting in my bedroom on the computer, and I hear this like rumbling. And I go to the window, and I open the window, and I stick my head outside. And I'm noticing it's coming from the parking lot right outside my place. And it's these two guys on a skateboard, on the gravel. So it's making this like brrr noise. And as I heard them kind of like falling and trying new things, they're speaking in an American accent, that there were these like two white guys. They're just like, damn, man, like try to do I used to know skateboarding terms. A snooki? No, that's not anything. An oogie? I'm just making things up, whatever. Like a sort of round off, And I kind of, after about 5 minutes of this rumbling and them talking to each other, I kind of yelled at them in this very it's 10 p.m., go home, whitey. I don't know. I wasn't like that, but it was funny for me. Anyway, close the window, go back to my computer. And about 10 minutes later, I hear a similar rumbling. And when I open the window, I notice that it's not coming from downstairs, not coming from the parking lot. It's coming from above, and it's much louder. And it starts getting really loud, and not just like a rumbling, like I start feeling it, and it starts shaking the ground a bit. And it's at about that point that I see 1, 2, and eventually 5 lights in the sky. And it became quite clear that these are either jets or rockets. And in that moment, after the port explosion, where the trauma has made me so perceptive to the endless possibilities, that anything could happen, I thought they were nukes, and I don't think I'm crazy for having thought that. And I rush in, I wake up my flatmate at the time, and go back, and we see this, and they just sort of keep going northwards. And the sound subsides, and it's kind of just, okay, we're not the targets. And I threw up, which is, to me, the most intense reaction that I have in these moments of anxiety. Is the vomiting. This is when I literally just cannot handle the situation. And I think my body can't handle it, and I just sort of project, literally, project out my emotions. That was the day I decided to leave, that I'm going to start preparing to leave, and it took me 6 months, but that was the moment. So what ended up happening is we discovered that this was an attack on Ladi, or Latakia. But anyway, it was an Israeli attack on Syria, and they used our airspace to shoot their missiles. So it would go undetected by Syrian air defense. And so, since it wasn't us that was a target of this, it just didn't make the news, and it wasn't anything. It was only something for those that experienced it. But even for those that experienced it, it doesn't hold as intensely as, like, actual attacks or the port explosion or all the other things that are sort of going wrong in the country and happening. But I really remember it, and it was one of the most painful things. And the Israeli jets that would keep showing up afterwards, just kind of as it's terrorism. There's really no other term for it. It's just terrorizing an entire civilian population. And all they can say is like, oh yeah, well, it's Hezbollah and whatever. But it's like, there's 2 million people. And also, fuck you. Like, I don't know, whatever. So, yeah. So what's sort of happening is my worst nightmare. And I really just, I really don't know what to think about it. It's painful, but it's just this feeling of impotence that there's really just nothing I can do about it from here. But even if I was there, and I don't know what anybody can do about it, because who's going to stop them? Like, what authority exists? And if they're challenging at like a military level, they're demanding a military response. And the only group that has any military capabilities of challenging that is Hezbollah. And, not the biggest fan, but like the Lebanese army is flaccid as it's nothing. But also they're complicit, or rather have just been fine with, letting the South be bombed. And they've just never been the actual ones to protect Lebanese against Israeli aggression. So it just really feels scary. And I obviously recognize my privilege being in Vienna talking about these things, but that doesn't really make any difference. I think there's one thing which I've been thinking a lot about, and I found myself doing, which is one of the only things that people seem to be kind of moved to point out in moments like this. And I think this actually is an expression of the very impotence that I was just talking about, is in seeing the kind of hypocrisy in Western media. And I found myself yesterday after the assassination, like I think a lot of us have been doing, checking what is the BBC saying, how's the New York Times, how's Fox News reporting this. And of course, all of them say this thing of like Dahia is a Hezbollah stronghold and an attack on a Hezbollah stronghold. And that this was like just a targeted assassination, and it was sort of legitimate as they frame it. And there's a lot of people that do this thing where they post the New York Times headline and then correct it, removing the honestly dehumanizing passive language, but also correcting some of these things like the BBC's obsession with this, Hamas-run health ministry, which is just a ridiculous thing to say. You never say the British-run NHS or the Lebanese, it just is the Palestinian health ministry in Gaza. but like many people are pointing out, it's a form of manufacturing consent, because then you associate everything to this boogeyman that we've already established is a terror group, which interestingly the BBC don't call, like not like the New York Times or CNN, like they just call it a terror group. And again, that's also part of this like ideological manufacturing of consent, because it makes it out to be a legitimate target, even though these are civilian residential areas, and this was rush hour. I'm losing the feeling of like what we can do, and a lot of the things that I do see people doing, I'm obviously not going to tell them not to do it, because I don't know, that would be ridiculous and cynical. But at the same time, I find myself doing it and then checking myself and wondering, what is the point? What do we really gain from constantly demonstrating that these media organizations that are situated within empire are complicit and reflect the desires and the ideologies of said empire? I don't know. I think there's definitely something to it, but at the same time, it just really demonstrates how little power we have, and, you know, in this sense, how few sources we have. We don't have our own version of the New York Times, you know, and we don't have the own reach and the own institutional power of all these things, of the Guardian, of the BBC. Definitely this podcast is one way for me to try to, in my own way, fix that balance, to say what I want to say, not just as a fix of what other people are saying, and other people as in people who are like directly complicit in genocide, like the New York Times. So yeah, I don't know. That's what's been weighing on my mind, and I think we're really going to be tense for the next week as we see what Hezbollah's going to do, what Iran's going to do, what Israel has planned next, and what the Americans are going to do. And I don't know, I'm just worried, very angry. And yeah, I don't know. Maybe this is a shift, and maybe this time it will be it. Or maybe it's just another delusion. Who knows? I guess we just have to wait to find out. And on that note, I think I'm going to wrap it up. This has been another episode of Politically Depressed. And if you enjoy this episode, and if you enjoy this podcast is being supported and hosted by the Fire These Times. And so if you'd like to support this project and the Fire These Times in general, head out to the Patreon, where you can support for as little as $5 a month. And one last thing, actually, if you're listening to this podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any other platform, please leave it a review. It really helps. And yeah, hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you next week.